All right, gang, here we go. Um, so this is a lecture on blocking, and it's one of those things that in our other world, our other parallel dimension, we would have done this in class. And I had an idea of doing it with little pieces on a floor plan, but it without me being there with you. Anyway, it wasn't going to work out. But I did want to get you this information because it is important information. And um, Blocking is it's essential to the director's toolbox, and it's really one of those things that is you know so much of what we talk about is you need to find your way. And certainly you need to find your way of blocking, but there are just certain parameters, certain rules, certain logistics you need to think about, certain ways you need to think about. And so this is intended to give you that information the best way that I can. So there are readings that go along with this. They're recommended now. I'm not requiring them, but you do have them in Moodle, and they are from A Director's Companion, which is Chapter 9, Staging, and that's the Mel Shapiro book. This. And then A Sense of Direction by William Ball, and that's pages 104 through 112. Again, all on Moodle. And then A Director's Craft by Katie Mitchell, and that's 178 to 180. They're all valuable, actually. I find these kind of some of the more helpful readings from these sources. And they're pretty short, so I would recommend reading them at some point. At least you have them. So when I think about blocking, the first thing to think about is whether you're in a world of psychological realism, which is very much like kitchen sink dramas. You're going to have a set that's very realistic, or if you're in a stylized world. So like we were talking about Bald Soprano last time, that's very much a stylized world. So when you have psychological realism, all actions. One of these wonderful people said all actions are derived from listening. So it's very much a purely psychologically motivated blocking. Everything is motivated as it would be in the natural world. That doesn't mean that, like in the natural world, somebody would come into your living room and you would just sit down and you would talk for 30 minutes. It doesn't mean you do that on stage because that's not interesting to watch, which we'll get to. But any kind of movement has to be at least supported by a natural motivation from your characters. When you're dealing with stylized, on the other hand, which you'll get to in some absurdist works, certainly, some other works like I mentioned last time, a dream play by Strindberg, which had to be very stylized because it was literally a dream. But the key to those is they're actually, in many senses, quite a bit harder because you need to still set rules for your environment. It can't just be like all the rules are gone and you can do whatever you want. It needs to have a strict set of rules, and that's up to you to implement. So, like back when I did Dream Play, I still needed to figure out where entrances and exits were. I still had to give the actors a sense of space, and that wasn't a room, but it was, here's a tree, and then a locomotive's going to come through here, and then the sound's going to come out here, and you need to react. So it still needs to be a concrete set of rules for your actors, based on, and that's going to go back to your point of view, and discussions with designers and that sort of thing. My favorite kind of work is starting in a real place and letting the stylized creep into that real. So you saw, for those of you, I think everybody maybe saw Hedda Gabler. I mean, Ibsen is known as the father of realism, right? He was the one who first kind of brought this purely psychological realism to the stage, these very complex characters that had to be reckoned with. But I wanted to bring in a sense of the stylized into that, primarily because I wanted to be able to deal with the suicide at the end in a stylistic way to allow the audience to take it in, and not to shock the audience out. And that was like one of the first goals I had in any conversations with designers and in staging. But then that led backwards to how am I going to justify that stylized language in this play of super realism? So I had to then work backwards and find those transitions in between acts, which were going to be my breakout pieces, which were going to be when the real becomes stylized. And I knew at the beginning, and this seemed to hold true from the postmortem and things we heard, was that first time when they broke out into the duel and she had the puppet strings on them, and David Bowie was playing, the audience had no idea what to do with it. That's okay. We talked about last time about disorientation. That was a moment of great disorientation for the audience to kind of shove them out of their seats and be like, wait, I thought I was watching one thing and now I'm watching something else. What the hell's going on? Made them lean in closer and try to figure it out. And then by the time we got through the next two breakout moments, they were like, okay, I totally get it. And then they can use that, okay, I totally get it, for the end where the suicide happened, so that they can accept that action in the stylized nature, and be able to reckon with it. So I hope that makes sense. But this isn't, I didn't make this up, by the way. This is actually very American in many ways. If you study American realism, you're going to study O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, Miller, Wilson, Shepard. All of these playwrights are American realists, but in every single one of them there is a magical quality, and I prefer to call them magical realism. I mean, if you look at even Glass Menagerie with Tom on the porch, right, or Fool for Love with the old man on the outer perimeters, and Miller has wonderful magical moments, and so does Wilson. So while those are looked at, and actually O'Neill spent the first half of his career creating really wild stylized plays, which I absolutely recommend you looking into, because by the time you get to Long Day's Journey, that is not indicative of the bulk of his canon. The bulk of his canon was actually quite wild. Yes. So my favorite is having a magical realism. Certainly there's the kitchen sink. That's that side of the spectrum, and then there is, Bald Soprano at the other end of the spectrum. I love playing in this middle ground. But the whole point of that is to say you have to decide what your piece is. Where in that spectrum does it lie? And therefore, what rules are you going to create for your actors when you go about blocking? So, what to keep in mind when you're blocking? Above all else, there's nothing you take away from this lecture. It is this. Everything has to be motivated. Everything has to be motivated. I tell my actors around like week 3, so like towards the end of the second pass, that if there is anything you are doing on stage and you don't know why you're doing that, you don't know why you're walking from point A to point B, you don't know why you're picking up this thing, you don't know why, if there's anything that you're kind of, you feel yourself doing because you're just hearing me in your head telling you to do that, please bring it up. Because my biggest bugaboo as an audience member is seeing unmotivated blocking. And it happens all the time. And you can tell that actor is moving because they were told to move there. They have no idea why they're doing it. And it brings me out of the scene immediately. And now that's a director's eye watching a play, consciously getting taken out of the scene. But I guarantee you, the person next to me who's never directed a show or knows the insides of the rehearsal process is watching that and is getting taken out because something in them is red flagging the falsity of it. So every movement has to be motivated, whether it's whether it's realism or whether it's stylized. Now, stylized, you're going to have different motivations, to be sure, but you still need to give the actor a reason so that they can play something. Because if they're not playing an action to get to where they're going to go, it's unmotivated and it's just going to fall flat and it's going to ring untrue and it's going to red flag and your audience is out of the scene. Yeah? Motivation above all else. Above all else. Visibility. Very real. The audience needs to see what's happening. And this depends a lot on configurations, which I'll get to in a second. But what's important for you as a director going into it, and we'll go into this a little more with configurations, is you need to know where your strong spots are and where your weak spots are, so that when you have one of your three climaxes happening, you know your actors are in the strong spots and not the weak spots, or your primary actors are in the strong spots. And if you have a bunch of actors on stage, then you know, okay, this actor, from a storytelling point of view, doesn't have as much to do in the scene, so that I can put them over here. Yeah, to balance the stage out, which I'll get to in just a second. So know your strong spots, and when I say strong spot, I mean that means the audience can, almost everybody in the room, if not everybody in the room, can see the story being told from that actor. So generally, this, right? Although some acting can be strong at given moments. And then the weak spots being, when the audience is seeing that, right? So know your strong spots and your weak spots, and balancing the stage and the action. And this is an aesthetic thing, but is an important thing, and it's something that it's something I don't catch my first time through, and I don't see until the stumble through generally, because generally what you're doing is you're because of conflicts and trying to honor actors' time and all of that, you're not going to be working sequentially through the show on your first pass, on your sketch, which we've talked about and I'm going to repeat later. But that first time we go through the show and you're sketching, you're blocking out, just kind of your first pass, your first choices, knowing it's all going to change, most of it anyway. Almost always I will do that first pass and I will get to the stumble through, and then I will watch, and then in the first act I'll be like, oh man, most of the action's on that side of the stage. I didn't realize that because we weren't going sequentially. So I need to start moving action around and making sure that the stage is balanced, because especially when you're in configurations like the round or the alley, but really in any configuration, if you have all the action happening over there for like 3 scenes in a row, the people on this side of the audience are checking out because they're just not being taken care of. The people on this side of the audience are fantastic, right? They're in it, but you got half the audience that isn't in it. So you need to go, okay, if that's 3 scenes in a row, I need to take that middle scene, that scene 2, and I need to figure out how to get it over here. And these are things to keep in mind when you're working with your set designer on a ground plan, knowing that. And we talked about like stepping through the whole play, knowing that you can do that. This is one of the things that you're looking for. Can I create balance on the stage through the whole play as I step through it? Yeah. And I really thought about that in head. I'm like, I have a fireplace over here, and then I have the window with the piano and the drink cart over here. I need to make sure that I'm going to be able to go back and forth and be able to take care of both sides, right? And create that stage balance. So balancing the stage is a big thing to keep in mind. And again, that's something that I usually see after the stumble through and then have to go back in and tweak. There was another one I did, the Grapes of Wrath, in a thrust. And it was a pretty deep thrust, and we'll talk about this in configurations. I misjudged it. And I realized that all of a sudden all my action was way down here, and there was a whole part of the stage I wasn't using at all, and I literally had to spend like 2 days pulling all the action back up so that it was an evenly balanced stage. Okay. Sustaining tension and avoiding static. This is huge, and this is kind of what I was talking about when, like, normally if 2 people came in and they had a lot to talk about, they'd go over, they'd sit next to the fireplace, and they'd just enjoy themselves for 45 minutes or whatever. Maybe somebody would get up to go get something to drink, right? That's not going to sustain that tension when you're watching a play. Very rarely, anyway. Very, very rarely. So you have to figure out how to purely motivate more action so that you can sustain the tension. And that motivation has to come from the script, and it has to come from whatever they're talking about. I had enormous challenges, which I think I was successful most of the time, and there were definitely times I was watching Hedda Gabler and I was like, nah, didn't figure that one out. And you should get used to that feeling as a director, because you never totally figure it out. But especially the 2-person scenes between Hedda and Taya over on the couch became extremely difficult to block because they really should just be talking on that couch. But if I just had them on that couch, then I was screwing a large part of the audience. So I had to have a motivation for them to get up, to move around, to maybe sit back down, to get up again, to come around, and that was hard. It was really really hard because you have to take care of your actors, and there were many times in that process where I could tell my actors were just like, you know, a good actor would be like, "Oh, I'll figure it out. Yeah, yeah, I can do that. No problem. I'll figure out a way to motivate that. Yeah." And then they'll do it, and you're like, "Oh, I'm just gonna give him a few more times." And like the fifth time, you're like, "I've screwed you. I have to help you. Let's figure out a different time for you to get up." You know, there's always solutions, but it is about sustaining the tension and avoiding the static. And the static will just it'll kill watching it because watching it you need some variety, but it's going to hurt the actors too because it's so hard to keep the stakes as high as you need if you're not providing them their body some way of matching their emotions. Yeah. So that doesn't mean you need people getting up all the time. Like you should have moments of rest. You should trust moments of rest. You should, in your script, go, this is an insanely important part. So I need these people to stand there and deliver it. Because they're on the flip side of this conversation is the actor who doesn't feel like they can root themselves and deliver. And there are times, many times, that they need to root themselves and deliver. And it's knowing which times are which. Knowing that you can move on that line because while we need to hear it, it's not the most important part of information of this story. Move on that line. But if you need to hear a line, they better be standing still or sitting down because the audience will not listen if they are not doing that. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Let me know in the questions if that doesn't, and we can talk it out. That's the hard part of this is because I don't know if I'm making sense. I hope I am. All right. So then there are two parts, and I think Shapiro talks more about this if you want to get more on these delineations. So there's composition and picturization. I do these things without knowing that they're called that, but they're important. So composition is what you see when you look at a landscape painting in a museum. Yeah. And in fact, I think it's Katie Mitchell who says it's just if you feel like you're weak on composition, go look at landscape paintings. Like they were really, really, really good at it. And it's how are you drawing people's eyes to the focus? And this isn't only with blocking, right? Lights are going to help with this. When I do shows outside with my company, music helps hugely with this. Live music helps hugely with this. But you are still creating a composition on stage with bodies and set pieces that are drawing focus and that are pleasing to the eye. One of the greatest directors of composition is Mary Zimmerman. She creates the most beautiful images that pulls you in. And honestly, the story can be lacking a little bit, and it doesn't matter because her compositions are so effing gorgeous. And even when she assistant directed her Guys and Dolls, which it's Guys and Dolls, but it was a gorgeous Guys and Dolls. And I'm not sure, by that point she had been doing it for so many years that it seemed innate. But look at her work if you're looking for some director examples. So composition, that's one thing, and we'll get to configurations because that's where some of this stuff breaks down a little bit. But composition and picturization, how Shapiro differentiates the two is picturization. I believe I'm right. It's storytelling through the composition. So you're telling a story through the blocking on stage. In Hedda, one of the reasons that I chose the alley, or folks at UNCA call it tennis court, which I'd never heard, but the idea that you've got an audience on both sides and the actions in between is because there's a confrontational nature in that. There's a so when I set up the duel in the dream piece, I set up that that confrontation, that dueling nature. And then there are at least two major moments, one between Brock and Hedda and one between Lovborg and Taya, which um, which repeated that dueling picture. And that was important for me. And anytime I looked for the moments where there was a duel going on within the scene, within the realistic scene, and I put them in that spot so that consciously or subconsciously the audience would feel the dueling nature of the scene. So that's a way that I used the blocking to create a picture to tell the story. And Shapiro does a pretty good job at explaining that further. So I would recommend you going through his. And again, it's one of those things that, like, I love knowing that now. I only know that because I've taught this class a few times. So I know the difference between it. But if before I'd known it, there was this kind of instinctual, like, how am I going to tell the story of this scene with the bodies in space? And essentially that's picturization. Yeah. So these are the things that you're thinking about as you're blocking, whether that's pre-blocking or whether that's in the room blocking. And that's honestly a good argument for, as an early director, to do some pre-blocking. And I think I've said it before, and we're going to get into some territory that I think we've talked about a bit. So this is some repeats, but it's still worth saying. I pre-blocked the shows I did before grad school, and I probably pre-blocked at least my first show in grad school to a certain extent, until I started to being able to trust myself to be in the room, and that to be a better way to create than me at home. So as an early director, I think I encourage it, because you can be thinking about composition as you pre-block. You can be thinking about picturization, so that when you're in the room, you're just more responding. Yeah, so you've kind of created this rough draft of this composition and picturization, and then you see if it works with bodies. We read Peter Brook's story where he pre-blocked, that huge entrance of all these actors in whatever the Shakespeare play was, one of the Henrys, I think. And he got there, and he asked them to do it exactly how he had written it out in his big old binder, and they did it, and it was a mess and a nightmare, and he realized that bodies in space act differently than bodies on paper. And that's true. So I guess as an early director, I would say go ahead and pre-block, knowing that that's your first draft, and then when you get in the room, you decide what you keep and what you're able to let go. But at least it'll put you through the mental exercise of what the picturization and what the composition is going to be, and maybe even what the balance will be. But you're not going to get the motivations until you have the bodies and the actors and the collaboration with the actors. And that's what pre-blocking. If you just stick to the pre-blocking, which this one I did, The Birthday Party by Harold Pinter. It's my first full-length show I directed, and I pre-blocked everything, and the blocking was gorgeous. It was really pretty. It was like a dance, like really gorgeously done, from no input whatsoever from the actors. So yeah, it was really pretty. Like, I got comments like, that was really pretty blocking. But it took the collaboration and the ownership out of the actor's hand completely. They just didn't have any. So that's the danger, right? So trying to find a happy medium of pre-blocking, but then letting the actors change that. So what I do now that I've had enough reps at it, and once I finally felt comfortable and realized that I can create a better first draft in the room with bodies than I can create at home with a ground plan and no bodies. So what I do is I kind of, like, I know I've gone through the set, like through the ground plan with my designer, and I know I've gone through that, and I have options. Like, I know at least somewhere there's a rough draft where I can refer to if I get into a bind. But I know my strong spots, and I know my weak spots. I know my entrances, and I know my exits. I know the area, and I spend some time with the script, knowing the scenes well enough, which I'm probably already done because I've fabled it and all that. Actually, going back to your fables can help this quite a bit, just as prep, as you go into the room. And that's just about what I know. And then I go into the room and I see what happens. So when you go into the room, the first thing to do with your actors, besides maybe get them, if you have the time, get them on the ground just to read through the script so that they can get that out in the air once before you get on your feet. And then go through the ground plan with them very specifically. Hopefully your stage manager has taped out the entrances and exits. Not only entrance and exits, but where does that exit go to? Where does that entrance come from? Going through all the rehearsal pieces, going through, if you're only dealing with blocks before the set gets in, going what these blocks are, what if you've got pictures from the designers on what they are, like everything helps. As specific as you can be about the imaginary world that you're putting your actors into, they're going to respond more specifically, right, and more interestingly, and create better choices. Okay, and I know I've gone through this before, so I'll go through it a little quick, but it's the 1, 2, 3. It's the sketch, and then a drawing, and then like the 3D. So the first time I go through is just a sketch. It is first choices. It is foundational. It is backbone, skeleton, whatever metaphor you want to use. It is the basic of the movement of what we're going to do. Make sure your actors have pencils and are writing this down. Make sure they are pencils, because they will not. They will erase. So the first time is just a sketch, just to get a sense of the scene. And really, like I go into it with the goal of getting a sense of the scene. Like, okay, and if I come to my time and it's a sense of the scene, then I'm moving on. If I get a sense of the scene, I'm like, I think that's as far as we can go with scripts in hand and how well we know the scripts at this point, and it's not time yet, then we're moving on, getting ahead of the game. Second time around, we're actually drawing now, right? Maybe a little bit of pen. And this either certain scenes that are tough nuts to crack, this might come right before the stumble through, because I need to get back to them because I hadn't figured it out yet. We came to our time. I wasn't anywhere close. Had to put it aside and keep moving on, so I can come back around to it before the stumble through and get that rough shape, But really, the drawing and pen comes after that stumble. Yeah. And then after that is the deeper work, is the really deeper work. So it's sketching in pencil, getting a rough shape, going back through it, refining that shape nicely. Some of this comes before the stumble. Some of this might come after the stumble. It just depends on scheduling and conflicts and play. In an ideal world, and if you have a short play, yay, then you would sketch in pencil, and then you would get back to everything and sketch in pen, and then you would do the stumble. And that's when the stumble turns into something that's even better than a stumble, and that's when you're in great shape. We got most ahead. As I remember, we sketched it. We got at least the first half done in pen before we stumbled, and the second half didn't need as much work. So it just depends on scheduling. But 3 passes, 1 in pencil, super shape, 1 in pen, getting nice and refined, and then that deeper. And this is when you're getting into runs, and you're working trouble spots, and everybody's off book, and they know their stuff so well, and it's just in their bodies, and you're just jamming. That's really fun. Now, once you've done that, and once you are running, and even once you go into tech, does not mean you are done blocking. You can block up until the night before opening, as far as I'm concerned. And I've had to do it before. When I did a dream play, my mentors couldn't come until the night before opening, just because they're very busy and had their own plays. And they came, and they gave me this one note. Well, they gave me a few notes, but this one major note. And it basically meant that I had to reblock the main character throughout the whole play. And I'm like, that would mean I have to reblock the whole character. And they're like, how much time do you have? I'm like, 40 minutes before we go. They're like, okay, you should be able to get that done. And I did. I got it done. And it just solved an enormous problem that I had. So you change. Hopefully, you're not doing that every time. That was more of a learn. That was a big learning experience for me, and I don't ever want to do it again. Um, but but even in tech, like if we're on hold because a lighting designer has to write a cue, and I see a fix I have to do, I run over there and I make that little fix and set it up, and then they have that throughout the rest of dress and everything. So never lock it. Now you shouldn't be. Again, this is one of the like finish blocking it, right? And not only finish blocking it, but pass through it a couple of times before tech. But that doesn't mean you're done tweaking. Because once a light cue happens, you're going to see it in a different way. Like, oh, I need you to come down this way. Or, oh, I need you to move a little bit earlier than you are. Yeah? Never stop discovering, I guess is what I'm trying to say. All right, configurations. Proscenium, and I've got these on the belt plot, right? So the proscenium is as if it's flat and all these are blocked out, and I think this is the best way you're going to get a proscenium in that space. But a proscenium is very much it's this, right? It's proscenium, and you've got the foreground, you've got the middle ground, you've got the backdrop, and it's what we're going to do with toy. That's how we're going to play with toy theater is in the proscenium. And fun fact, I don't think I've ever directed anything in the proscenium except for toy theater. Just my personal preference. This proscenium, what its advantages are, is it provides the greatest ability for painting, for composition, and for picturization, because you control exactly what the audience is seeing. Now, yes, so an audience member down close, an audience member up in a balcony or whatever, are going to have slightly different idea, but they're still going to be seeing this picturization, right? This composition. I think Mary Zimmerman exclusively directs in the proscenium. I can't think of. No, there was one where she didn't, and it wasn't nearly as successful that I can think of. I'm sure there were others, but the ones that I've seen that were gorgeous were in the proscenium because she is a painter on that stage. It will challenge the psychological motivation of blocking the most. There's no question about it, because you've got to open up. The actors have to open up. The actors have to move in ways they wouldn't necessarily move in real life, because they have to make sure and keep the picture correct and make sure and keep the sight lines. It's harder, and that's part of the reason I don't like it, I think. So then the round, I probably don't have to show you this, but that's the round, right? I love the round. I love the round for philosophical reasons, theoretical reasons. I love the circle. I love people seeing each other. I love how it simplifies the design, because you can't have huge set pieces because they'll get in the way completely. I love everything about the round. The only thing I don't love about the round is when you don't have enough audience and you never actually get to have the round. Right, so we did the round in my theater company many years ago for 6 Degrees of Separation, and we had evenings where everybody was on all four sides. We also had evenings where it was on two opposite sides, so we're in the alley that night. We also had evenings when it was on one side, so we had the proscenium that night. I do find the round can only happen, it can only exist when you can consistently at least come close to selling out a house. Or you can be outdoors and get the crowd in the circle. But I did the round my first year with my theater company, and even though we'd had enough people to do it in the round, and we had a whole spiel at the beginning, like, sit on all four sides, that's how we blocked it, nobody ever did. Ever. So, the round is challenging in that way. There's very little picturization that can happen here in composition because everybody is seeing something different, right? So you can have composition directed for the person sitting here, but this person sitting over here, they're not going to get that. What you're basically doing is you're making sure everybody's taken care of at every moment. So that means that everywhere in the house, they have somehow they can see the story unfolding, right? So they can see at least one actor's face, listening to the story or telling the story. It puts a real big onus on this idea of picturization, of telling the story through the blocking and through the action of the characters, because you're going to get a lot of characters with their backs to audience. I mean, at any point, an actor will throw their back at some audience member in the round. It's inevitable. But that actor still needs to be telling a story. So whether that means they're standing, sitting, crouching, what their posture is, what they're, I'll often be telling actors like, I'm just going to need you to make that gesture twice as big so that the people behind you are going to get it. Because if you just do this, they're not going to get it. Yeah. So you're trying to take care of everybody all the time and trying to think of ways to tell that story, even if they're not face to face with the actors. It does provide more access to psychological motivation because the actors have more freedom to move anywhere they want to, which is nice, and that's another reason I like it. Diagonals. This is a funny round, right? Diagonals typically are really, really, really strong. So the diagonal would be that, typically. Now, it's hard because these VOMs are kind of weirdly offset in the Belk. So the diagonals are still good, but they're not, they're kind of funky lines. However, the VOM spots are huge, huge. So, actually, I guess, yeah, here. These spots on the stage are your strongest spots, bar none, because everybody can see you and your back is to the VOM. Yeah, and even these people that are right here are going to be able to see a little bit of your profile. So those are the strongest spots for the Belk. A lot of rounds, really, I prefer my rounds super tight without these big aisles because energy gets dispersed very easily through those aisles. So it's a funny space, but it's still a beautiful round, and I, except for the audience problem, I always encourage it. The alley, which we did Hedda in, right, was this. So we still had the strong spaces here and here, but here and here became extremely strong. So if your back was to the window or your back was to the fireplace, everybody was going to generally see you unless they were seated in spots where they shouldn't have been seating. So we had the VOM spots, we had the fireplace, we had the window that became extremely strong. And that's why I put the suicide in the window, because I knew that was going to be the strongest spot for her on stage. In the script that we had, the suicide was at the piano, and honestly, it would work amazing if you could do that, but I just wasn't going to be able to get everything I wanted there. So we put her in the window. There's a level, especially, now Hedda was kind of a big, huge alley, but if you so I did Fool, we did Fool in an alley, and the hotel walls were like that, and it really, it got even more compression, and the audience on both sides, there was like a voyeurism to it, and we were also watching the other audience watch, so there was a voyeurism to that as well. There's this wonderful kind of depth in the alley that you have that you don't have in the proscenium, in my opinion, so that when you're blocking, there's a lot of, as a director, there's a lot of over-the-shoulder shots, film term to be used, but like, if I were sitting and I could see kind of overhead his shoulder as she was talking to Brack, and it was just a really pretty image that you'll never get in the proscenium, so that I adore. And similar to the round, you're just making sure everybody's taken care of. And it's slightly easier than the round in that sense because you've got these walls that'll give you more options for that. But I love the alley. The thrust is a tricky thing. So you could have a thrust that, right, where the backdrop is there, and then you're almost directing in the round, right? If the thrust is that deep, which Company was, right, you're essentially directing in the round. You're not directing in a proscenium or a thrust, really. You've got this space to have a backdrop and to have some piece of large scenery, but the action is all going to be out here, and it's essentially in the round. However, if you have a thrust that's, I got to do this, like doing it in a mirror, then it's essentially the proscenium. Yeah, I did Grapes of Wrath in a thrust like this, and that's why I thought I could put all my action. down here because I thought, oh well, it'll be like all these people are watching, all these people watch this action here, and it just became really immediately clear that all the action had to be moved upstage, and then I could come down from time to time, but most of it had to be up, and essentially that's working in the proscenium. So you're working with the back, the middle, and the front. So the thrust to me is like this weird purgatory between configurations that I've grown to kind of not like. And then the final one is the promenade. And I love the promenade, and it is so tricky. So the promenade is this idea that you walk through the space, that the audience space and the acting space is the same space. Yeah. And there's this really hard line between being inclusive, including the audience in the world, in the play, in the imaginary land, and that's awesome, the inclusive nature. But the intrusive nature is what gets dangerous, is because all of a sudden you're having actors up in audience members' space, or you're asking the audience to do things they're not prepared to do. Sleep No More is a good example of the very dicey territory. And it's tough. Now, one of my favorite theatrical experiences ever was it was Pirates, and it was an adaptation of Pirates of Penzance, and the Hypocrites did it in Chicago, and you should look it up. They toured with it. They did installments in New York and installments in Berkeley and installments in Boston. They did it all over, and it was so joyful because you shared the stage with this version of the Pirates of Penzance, which was done with great joy. And they say the rules at the beginning. They're like, the actors will be coming through. If they need to get get through where you are, they'll just tap you on the shoulder. If you could just step up and let them keep going. And so they had ground rules at the beginning that were very clear and were not intrusive. And then the piece itself was so joyful that it was amazing. It was great. I actually tried to do the exact same thing in school with an adaptation of Pericles by Shakespeare. Which I think was kind of successful. It was really fun. But the entire space was our stage, and we were right there with the actors, and it was lovely. I also do Promenade now with my Christmas show that I do up at the Vance Birthplace. It's a adaptation of A Christmas Carol with Zebulon Vance, this North Carolina complex, controversial figure. As Scrooge, but the audience members are Zeb, so they have a name tag that says, "Hi, my name is Zeb," and they go through a version of the Christmas Carol where they're visited by ghosts. And we're trying to talk about very real issues of the complexity of this historical figure, as well as the enslaved people who lived on this property. And we do it through this promenade show that takes you into the main cabin, and then it takes you to the loom house, and then it takes you to the tool house and the garden and to the smokehouse, and finally you end up in the slave cabin. And we do it with toy theater as well, which brings some delight to the story that allows people to take it in more. But this idea of the promenade show that takes them throughout the entire historical site works really, really well. And it's fun. And so the promenade, I think, is just, it's rife with challenges and problems, but it's also some of the most creative ground you can possibly work on. Those are the configurations. Interestingly enough, we're going to be working at the proscenium with our project, right? We're going to be doing it in toy theater, so it will be the proscenium. And that is most things. I mean, I'm an exception to the rule that I haven't worked in the proscenium hardly at all. So we'll be in the proscenium, which is what we have now. It's the box we're working on. So for next week, again, when you get to the end of this, send me an email with at least one and no more than 3 thoughts, at least one and no more than 3 questions on all of this. Monday, please have read Anne Bogart's Stereotype. It's a fantastic chapter. It's always eye-opening for me, and we will talk about that. I will be getting your fables now, or now is Tuesday, but tomorrow, Wednesday. when this thing goes live. I will be getting your fables. I will be giving you feedback on those fables as quickly as I possibly can. Hopefully, most of them will be sent out by the end of our class time. If anybody needs class time, just let me know. Office time, let me know. Looking ahead, next Wednesday will be first thoughts on your play. So be after that, and I think that's it. I made it through this in my own home with no child screaming. Hallelujah. Hope everybody's doing well, staying safe. I can't wait to see your faces on Monday.